Again, my name's Andre Salais. I'm the president of a secular student group at ASU. It's a chapter of the Secular Student Alliance. I am studying political science and religious studies, and what I'm really interested in as a student is the impact of religious beliefs and religious social systems on political behavior and political outcomes. So human rights, issues of conflict, it's kind of my area of interest and study. But I am currently working on a book called Conflict Ethics, which is actually addressing specifically conflict ethics in warfare and in violent conflicts globally, ranging everywhere from early Christian ethics on just war, through fascism, through vanguard communism, to modern just war theory.
All right, man. Well, look forward to seeing that stuff from you, and do appreciate you coming on the show today. So today, the topic we agreed to sort of discuss, from two different perspectives. Obviously, I'm Christian, I'm Reformed. How would you describe yourself as far as worldview terms as you enter the discussion? Like in general, we don't like labels, but at the same time, they help us understand some things about positions. How would you describe yourself? Secular humanist, agnostic, atheist? What's your sort of favorite?
Okay. Well, as far as that goes, I would have to label myself as, in relation to religion, as an atheist. I don't have a belief in a God. I don't believe that I can disprove the existence of a deistic God, but I don't see any evidence for one, so that would make me atheistic. As far as my worldview is concerned, I would have to say I am a naturalist. I am not a moral relativist, so I do believe that there can be something to be known about morality. I just don't. I don't believe it's something that has to be pre-existent in the universe. I think human experiences are sufficient enough for us to be able to develop a moral theory. Since when it comes down to it, it's really about what's important to conscious creatures.
Well, that's probably a good place for us to start our discussion about human rights. When we ask what is the foundation or the source or where do they come from, human rights, it seems like a good idea for us to discuss this term human in relation to it. And so, Andre, when we ask what is a human, I would take, going into the discussion, a decidedly Christian-specific view. And so if someone said, what to you is a human, I would start off saying, human is one created in the image of God. So that would be my baseline. So throughout our conversation, you'll probably hear me refer to the imago Dei a lot, which is, the Latin term, for those who don't know, for the fact that humans are created in the image of God. And that means certain things, and I believe a political theory that is couched in Christian theology should be working those out. So there's other things I could say about what it means to be a human, but that would be the bottom of where I would start. You can ask me a question on that, or maybe lay out what you would say about what you think it means to be human and how that's relevant to this discussion.
Well, I don't think I have any questions for you on your position as far as a foundation goes. If I'm correct, you're going for the human dignity because we are created in the image of the divine, essentially. Well,
so if there is the ontological trinity, the transcendent God described in Scripture, he exists, and then in Genesis 1, 26, 27, 28, where it says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And then there's what's called the dominion mandate, which is a sort of co-regence over creation, and then it names different animals. Then in verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And it says he blessed them, said, be fruitful, multiply, have dominion. It's not domination, though, it's dominion. So not just human dignity, but everything about what it means to be a human is rooted in that created fact, our creatureliness. And so it's not just dignity, but it's rationality, it's choice, it's a different metaphysical sort of makeup than other living things in the universe. It's all those kinds of things.
Okay. Well, for me, I don't ascribe any sort of significance that would be innate to human beings as biological creatures. I think that we find significance in simply our day-to-day interactions with one another. We want to live in a society in which we can enjoy the fruits of human cooperation. Inevitably, what it comes down to is, for me, biology, just for calling someone human. But the greater qualities of that, I think, come from our social nature and the things we're able to create together as a species.
All right. Well, so let me give you one example of what I mean when I talk about how there's implications. Some of them are even in Scripture itself. And so then after I read this, then I would say, then how would you proceed to get to the same place that a verse like this gets, obviously without revelation without resorting to the same resource? So Genesis 9:6, God says to Noah, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." And so there's a dictate about a law based upon, obviously, the createdness, the image of God in humanity, and that results in thou shalt not murder. Of course, one of the 10 Commandments as well. Now, that's sort of a big-ticket item, but even in the book of James, James tells actually fellow Christians, hey, blessing and cursing shouldn't come out of the same mouth. How can you say you bless God and then turn around and curse your brother who was made in the likeness of God? So even down to that sort of basic level of making fun of others, insults, is also contrary to recognizing the value, dignity, worth inherent in humanity. So it's the big and it's the little. How would you get to those same places?
And that's an excellent question. This is dealing with me personally. I don't think that I can say.
Yeah, you're just you. You're not a spokesman for everyone in the world that says they ascribe to your position. I agree with that.
Oh yeah, and there's a variety of different viewpoints on morality that are held by non-believers. Mine happens to deal with looking as objectively as possible at the flourishing of human individuals. And when we take the idea of morality, objective morality, out of the realm of the cosmological, it's not something that is a concern of the universe, which it really isn't. If we lived in a universe that was made up of nothing but rocks, there would be no questions of morality. But for us, being conscious creatures, there's questions of morality and how to live together in a functioning cooperative society. So if we take that into consideration, that people will want to live in a society in which they can reap the benefits of cooperation, in which they're not going to have to fear being robbed or threatened or murdered, we can, I think, objectively say that there are decisions we can make as individuals which either support human flourishing or are a hindrance to that. So murdering somebody, obviously, is a hindrance on that individual's flourishing. Stealing from them is a hindrance on their flourishing. There could be some gray area. I acknowledge that. But there could also be equally good ways to achieve human flourishing, in the same way that there could be equally bad ways to not achieve human flourishing. So it's not about one thing being better than another. When we're talking about bad things or do you get what I'm getting at? So.
Yeah, so then on the scale, from your perspective of human evolution, when would you say on this evolutionary timescale the concept of human rights first emerge, if it's not innate or inherent?
The concept of human rights.
So when is that a real question for the humankind to ask?
That's a good question. I don't know that I'm the appropriate person to answer that, as I'm not a historian.
Well, no, I mean along the lines of, like, for example, would you think let's say you have Australopithecus.
Uh-huh.
Is human rights a question for them?
I can't say. I don't know if Australopithecus would be a self-aware creature.
Would you say Cro-Magnon man? That's a question that's relevant to him.
Well, the problem here is I don't have the opportunity to engage Cro-Magnon man and see if they even understand these concepts. But what I can say is human beings being an innately social creature, and this is biological, the interests of society are something that is important to us just as social animals.
Okay. So, because if there's nothing innate about it, there's nothing inherent about being a human that entails certain rights and privileges, it's sort of sounds like to you a pragmatic outworking of some people wanting to get along for various reasons. That's what it sounds like. It sounds like a sort of very pragmatic way that it's approached, but it's not necessarily anything specific to humans by virtue of what they actually are.
I would have to agree. It's not something specific to us by virtue of what we are. But
Okay.
I think...
All right, we'll be back in a second. I'll let you continue that thought. And today our guest is Andre Salais. He's the president of the SSA at ASU. How do you do? He's here in the studio. We're having a dialogue, and he writes for the Unbelievers blog. Okay. So, Andre, in the first section, we're asking this question together. You as an atheist, myself as a Christian, about where do human rights come from? In the first section, we talked about what is a human, and we ended up in a spot where where I said the Imago Dei is the key aspect to what defines humanity, and you said a key part of your understanding of the discussion is the fact that humans are social creatures, so therefore they ask these questions, but there's not necessarily a thing inherent about humanity that says we have rights, but it's just sort of a natural outworking of the place we find ourselves in currently. Is that a good synopsis, or would you want to add anything about what we said so far?
I think that's a good way to approach it, and I think one of the big differences is when I say I don't think that we have any sort of innate moral nature about us. It's not something about being human that makes us moral or gives us worth. I think that's something that has to be rationalized. And when we're looking at ethics and human rights, we can rationalize what is appropriate in that field of thinking based on how it affects conscious creatures, whether it benefits their flourishing or is a detractor to flourishing.
Do you believe then, when we add these kind of ideas of humans and rights, that all humans should have the same set of rights?
I do.
So then you would say that considerations about, for example, IQ or family of origin, things like that, you don't think those should be judged as relevant in the discussion?
I do not. I will say, though, I outlined a bit of an ethical theory based on a concept of human flourishing. There's no practical decision procedure for that. So we have to consider that, though that's where I think some form of objective morality may come from, the fact that we may never know actually what decisions are going to produce the best possible outcome.
Right.
So that taken into consideration, each person's objections to a proposal made by other people must be considered, and we are left with rationalizing our moral decisions, and we could very well end up at a wrong place.
Do you see a disconnect between the end goal of your political program, if you want to put it that way, being the human flourishing and all humans having equal rights? For example, Aristotle, Politics, Book 1, Chapter 2, I would say basically put forth an idea that seems to put the state primary, and then those who are able to contribute most to the state sort of are granted lofty civic privileges, but then the underclass of those who are not sort of contributing as much, it's not necessarily that they're, killed at random, but there's definitely, to say the least, ignored because they're not, by definition, contributing as much. So to me, I see a disconnect. Do you feel that disconnect between flourishing, all have equal rights?
That's an excellent point to bring up. And when I say equal rights, I'm not referring to necessarily a purely socialist or communist sort of idea of everyone is the same. And what I'm talking about is more in the sense of a philosopher like John Rawls, the idea that we should all be able to start from the same place. And if you're familiar with John Rawls, he proposes that people in what he calls the original position, where you have people behind a veil of ignorance, unaware of what their lot in life is going to be. They don't know what their personal talents are going to be, whether or not they might be a slave or a slave owner or wealthy or poor. So people in this position would obviously want to maximize their potential benefit, but also minimize their potential suffering. So maximize the minimum, essentially. They would want to avoid the worst possible suffering and have the highest possible low level in society.
So how does that answer the question of the disconnect between human flourishing? Because some contribute more to the human flourishing, why should they not be granted more rights?
So it's,
if that's your end goal. So your end goal is pragmatic, human flourishing. Aren't those there who contribute more? For example, how does a quadriplegic contribute equally to someone who works 60 years of their life, 40, 50 hours a week? How do they contribute equally to human flourishing in your view?
We could look at someone like Stephen Hawking, who's made incredible contributions to science, and he's not able to contribute in a physical manner.
So what if he was born 300 years ago?
If he were born 300 years ago, he would likely have died for lack of proper medical treatment. But that doesn't mean that was his fault that he was born into that condition.
But he still deserves the same equal rights, even though he's sort of feeding on the labors of others because he's at their mercy, but he still deserves the equal rights. How does he contribute to human flourishing? Actually, wouldn't he detract from it?
I think what we're looking at here is our view of rights are in two different areas. I think what you're looking at is contributions to society as it exists right now. I'm looking at equal rights as from that original position that I had referred to, where people ignorant of what their lot in life would be would likely choose a society in which they would be guaranteed to avoid the worst possible suffering, but in which they would still have an opportunity to have some inequality, some more benefit for themselves. So looking at this, I think a good example would be far worse to be a serf in a feudal kingdom, to be the poorest person under a monarchy, but it would be nice to be a monarch. Now, if we look at a more egalitarian system like in Denmark, for example, it would be less bad, far less terrible to be a poor Dane than to be a serf.
You're saying better and worse. Who's making that judgment, and what are you using to feed into your definition of better and worse?
Well, I'm looking at the suffering of the individual in particular.
So why is that for you the determinative category of what makes something better or worse?
Why am I viewing the individual suffering as the determinant category?
Yeah, because why is suffering the main thing?
What would be an alternative to suffering as a concern for human values?
I don't share your worldview that that's the most important thing, and that's not, so I'm not getting rights out of this sort of network of contingencies. I'm getting rights out of something that are owed by people to other people because they have been bestowed by God. And when God bestows duties to his creatures that he has made, to be able to actuate those duties, to be able to do them, to actualize them, there's certain rights and privileges that must be in place for the duties to be able to be actualized. And so when the law states something negatively, it also states something positively. Thou shalt not steal is the negative view of God's outworking of what we should be doing. But then that means there are property rights is the positive takeaway. And then it goes down the list. Just like thou shalt not murder, the negative, the positive then is their life is valuable, should be protected. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's why I'm asking you how these factors are working to get you this matrix of rights.
Okay. I was mentioning earlier the idea of being the difference between the suffering one might experience being a poor person under an absolute monarchy versus the suffering someone might experience being a poor person in a more egalitarian society like Denmark. That difference is huge. But if we look at the benefit someone receives from being a wealthy Dane versus being a king, the difference in their benefit really isn't that great. So the argument from the Rawlsian perspective is that people would prefer to lessen that minimum, that degree of suffering, but still allow for some sort of inequality to motivate themselves in society.
Why is wealth, poverty, what you keep on referring to when you refer to better or worse? Because to me, it sounds like you have a crassly or nakedly materialistic view of how this works. And when I hear that, the next logical step, I'm not saying you're going there, but that's why I understand why people go to a more socialistic or maybe even more communist, maybe more Marxist system because of what you're saying, because you're making this dialectic between wealth and poverty so determinative in what's important in human rights, which really, the other thing I see in your discussion, Andre, is these don't really sound like human rights. These sounds like societal agreements we make based upon human wants. And that's just not the same thing. I don't know if that critique resonates with you, but help me understand the importance of possessions or whatever in your worldview. And then what about this issue of, are these really just human wants, and why are those so maximal?
Good question. And I go after wealth just because it's easy for people to grasp, but there's a great many things which would likely be discussed by people who are trying to form a society
such as
ignorant of what the world looks like. For example, freedom of conscience would be one.
What is freedom of conscience upon your worldview? So you take into account that we've evolved a long line, train of other biological organisms. Now here we are. You've got to help me understand from an empiricist understanding, or if I can get at this with scientific tools, what does freedom of conscience even mean to you?
I have a right to my thoughts. I have a right to my thoughts and my beliefs, and someone else can't essentially impinge upon that. I happen to
How's that conscience? Isn't that freedom of brain reactions? See, meaning, what do you think thoughts and beliefs are produced by? Aren't they biological in their origin?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so then how's it freedom of conscience? Because conscience seems like a null and void concept.
Well, see, this is a common mistake that's made when assessing a naturalistic view of conscience, and that it doesn't matter because it's biological.
I didn't say it didn't matter. I'm asking you if the concept has actually any merit.
If it has any merit
upon your worldview. Well, I don't see how it seems like you're saying my neurological reactions, I'm allowed to have them.
Well, yes, they matter to me. They matter to you. They matter to everybody who has them.
I didn't say they didn't matter. I'm just saying, how's that freedom of conscience? Isn't that freedom of
1 minute
of brain activity?
Well, it'd be freedom of brain activity, but I don't see them as separate.
What is conscience? Where did you get that concept from?
Freedom of conscience?
Yeah. Conscience. Where did you get that from? From within biology. I don't understand where conscience came into play all of a sudden.
Well, if I feel that I have a moral obligation,
a duty. Who gives you these duties? So how do you have a duty? Who's the duty holder that says do this?
Well, see, this is the thing, is that can differ from person to person based on how they are viewing ethics, and I view it as something which would be objective. But others may not. This is a problem for human creatures, and this is why it's something that needs to be discussed.
All right, well, I'll let you continue that, as well as we'll try to play a brief clip from Christopher Hitchens discussing the question of the foundation for human rights on our last segment with Andre Salais, and my friend Andre Salais, who's over the ASU putting in work, a lot of stuff with the Secular Student Alliance. And hey, I appreciate, we had David Fitzgerald on before the show, and just so everyone knows, when David and I discussed that question about did Jesus actually exist, Andre's really the main person who made that happen, enabled us to link up with David, so we really appreciate that, and thank you for sort of giving us a good word and all that, and we're glad to have you today. On this discussion, where do human rights come from? We ended sort of in the ethical realm because we're talking about duties, obligations, and all that, and I want to let you continue your thought before we proceed. What do you want to say on that?
Well, and I think before we went to the break, I mentioned that individuals hold moral viewpoints, though I think there's something objective to be seen to be known about morality. Others may not, but this is where I add a decision procedure to it. Though we may not actually know what is objectively moral, I think we can approach it almost scientifically and have each person's input regarding what is moral considered. When we're considering a moral decision, I think that the best decision to make would be that to which no one is able to rationally object to. Now, this does imply that we can be wrong, but I think given that our knowledge is limited, that might be the best course of action.
Can I play this clip? And I'm not saying you'll agree or not agree. This is just a good way for us to discuss our next question, which is, what is the foundation? But here's Christopher Hitchens at Oxford, part of the Veritas Forum. Listen to what he says about this.
When you said, what's my grounding? How do I know there are such things as human rights? I don't know there are such things. I have a very strong suspicion that Bentham might have been right about that. That they're certainly not from God, because if they were, a few more people would have them, or have had them. The concept is only a few hundred years old. It had to be wrung out of the bogus concept that there was a right, but that it was a divine right and only for kings. It's an attempt to negate and spread that, made by Thomas Paine. My strong suspicion is also you don't get the rights you don't fight for. So that's my grounding. I think our position there is about as tenuous as our position as a primate species on a rather dodgy planet.
All right, we have some...
Unsupervised.
All right, so Andre, react to that from your perspective.
I think as far as human rights go, I don't think it's a thing. It's not something that exists in and of itself. It's something that human beings can rationally agree upon based on our interest in not suffering as individuals. That would be my position on it. But I'd have to agree. I don't think that we may necessarily know what human beings are going to determine our rights, whether or not our moral decisions on rights are correct. Mistakes can be made, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
All right, so when I would say there's a foundation for human rights, again, it would go back to what people are by virtue of the Imago Dei. So even if a person says, I don't think that's true, anything like that, it seems like they should be able to understand the connection between the anthropology the Christian is positing and the outworking of it, because they're saying there's an explicit connection that's actually, like I said, when I read Genesis 9:6 and some other places, there's scriptures and Proverbs that talk about the poor and the rich. The Lord is the maker of them all. When you see that, you see a direct connection between who we are made in God's image. And part of that includes our rationality. It includes our self-awareness. But ultimately, it's just sort of the defining characteristic of humanity. And then, therefore, what that means we inherently have. And see, I think this is where I see some of this in the founding documents popping up with terms like we hold these truths to be self-evident or inalienable rights. You know, this idea of these are inherent in what it means to be a person. And then of course, you have that all men are created equal. You have these concepts there. I'm not making the argument in this discussion, America's a Christian nation. I'm not doing that. All I'm talking about is I think those ideas are there. So I see a logical connection. I understand you're saying, so here's pragmatically what we have to do. I would actually ask, why do we have to do it? I don't really see why we have to do it, but I'm still trying to see the logical connection between your view of origins and your view of rights, your view of anthropology and your view of political theory. I still don't see the connection other than, well, what else can we do? But that doesn't seem like a firm foundation, Andre, to me. Help me out. Mm-hmm.
Well, I kind of wish you had played a Sam Harris clip. I probably would have agreed with that a bit more. But,
okay.
I mentioned what I view as the best as an approach to objective morality, and I don't think it's a practical one because you simply can't assess every possible effect our actions can have. But my decision procedure, and this is provided mainly by Thomas Scanlon, this decision procedure, I think, is the best way to approach it based on the information that we have available to us. I think rationalizing it is the best way to go about it in the same way that we do with science. I do not think accepting the ethical commandments of a God necessarily makes something moral, especially if you're familiar with the Euthyphro dilemma. We can't know that what God is commanding is moral.
This is true, but if you notice in my discussion, I'm always going to the Imago Dei. So I hear what you're saying, but I never said, see, the direct connection is the big principle. So we have obligations. There's where, when I say there's duties before our Creator by virtue of us being made. So there's God's sovereignty into play. But then we actually have duties and responsibilities as co-regents of the environment he has given us. And if you notice when it says have dominion, it names animals and the planet, and it says care for them. It doesn't say other people. Do you see what I'm saying? It doesn't have other people in the list.
But the Old Testament does have other people in the list. When in Exodus, it outlines rules for the owning and sale of slaves, genocide against the Canaanites, the Midianites, the Moabites.
How is it related, the idea that they are doing this warfare against those tribes, that they're not made in the Imago Dei or therefore not fully human or something? And it says their iniquity and wickedness is filled up to the brim. That's what the Old Testament language is. It has to do with judgment.
So their wickedness would merit genocide.
See, so you understand genocide is a new concept, and if you know the history of the word, it has to do with the Armenian massacres, and the sort of social scientists who put this in play had to do with what Islam did to the Christians living in their midst. So I feel you're being
Christians did to Muslims in Spain.
Well, that's not where it came from. That's not where it came from. So that's not where genocide came from. And you understand genocide means wiping out an ethnic group. So what's the reason given for the Canaanite destruction? It is due to their wickedness. But see, you can like critique that, and that sounds good to modern ears. But Andre, I challenge you. You have no real foundation to have a problem with that anyway. It's getting us off trail, but it sounds good, and everyone's like rah rah. But Andre, what's the duty or obligation that these evolved creatures have to that group? They have none, and you can't show they do.
I don't mean to get you heated on this topic, because I'm not attacking your worldview, and I know that you don't believe in those things. You obviously, I can't imagine you being violent towards anybody.
Right, but I do believe in the validity of God's judgment upon unrighteousness, and that's why Jesus is needed. So I do believe in the base root concept. So I'm not one of those Christians who gets away from that, because that's a reality of the Christian worldview.
And I think part of that falls on whether or not we believe that there is a God, and the God is the arbiter of morality.
The source. I don't know about the word arbiter.
Okay, well, we could say a source of morality, but I mean, for me, I have no evidence that there is a God.
Let's say there's no God. Let's say the Canaanite attacks happened. You, using your worldview, tell me why it was objectively wrong. Because let's say this tribe says, we need to better flourish. The way for us to better flourish is to come up with an excuse to kill another people group, because we want to live where they live. And so we will band together to exorcise them out of this region by extinction. Now we have their stuff, their land. By the way, their stuff actually is not part of the equation. If you look, the Israelites were not allowed to take any of the stuff. Do you remember? And Achan was killed by Yahweh because he took something from the camp there at Jericho. So you see that wasn't part of it. It wasn't, they weren't even allowed to have it. But with that being said, how does that
apply to the virgin women?
Okay,
who they did
that's not in Jericho. That's not in Jericho. See, I'm talking about Jericho.
Okay.
So, but I'm just saying, you tell me why it was objectively wrong for their flourishing to trump over someone else's flourishing. You've got to tell me, because they're not connected.
Of course. And what I was talking about was the flourishing of individuals, human individuals as part of a society. So,
two societies. One wants to flourish, and they have the means to make another not flourish so they can flourish. Why is it wrong?
But we have human individuals in the Canaanite society as well who also want to flourish.
Why do they have to care? Because they care about their own flourishing. They're not neurologically connected. They're not psychically connected. What's the connection between them and them?
Well, it's like asking why I should care about you, and not if I were to break into your home and try to steal things from you or injure you. Why should they care?
Yeah.
Because it would matter to them if the Canaanites attacked them.
But they're not attacking them, so that's not a good answer, Andre. Because
how is that not a good answer?
Because they're not attacking them. I'm challenging you to say you have no justification from within your worldview to tell me why one group's flourishing should not be more important to them than another group's flourishing. It almost seems, by definition, of course this group's flourishing is more important to them than the other groups. Why should they not be able to take hold of it by the way nature always has, tooth and claw?
Well, I think I've explained earlier on that this isn't something that I believe we can practically assess in the world. We have to look at, I mentioned the original position. People not knowing, let's see, we could take the Canaanites and, take any two societies. Say they don't know what society they're going to be in. Each of these individuals wants to avoid being murdered. So it would behoove them to
Doesn't make sense that they want to avoid murdering others, though. They want to avoid being murdered. What's one sure way to do that? Murder the other.
Okay.
I'm just saying, on evolution, you cannot critique
How do you establish a social standard to avoid being murdered if you're going to permit murder?
You do it within your own society, and by the way, that's what most people groups do.
Well, that's what I mentioned, is if we're talking about people who are ignorant of what their lot in life is going to be, which is obviously an impractical approach, this is all in the theoretical. If we're talking about people who are ignorant of what society they're going to be in, they want to avoid being killed if it happens that they end up in the society that's going to get the society that would be attacked. So I would imagine that people in these circumstances would want to prohibit murder just in case they're in that tribe.
All right, Andre, let's just say what they did was wrong, whether God exists or not. So what happens to them? What's it mean? They violated their duties or obligations, to whom I know not. But what happens to them then upon your ethical theory of justice?
What do we do to them?
No, what happened to them?
For violating
whatever it is you think they violated.
You mean cosmologically?
Anything. Tell me what happened to the Israelites because they did this.
Well, it benefited them specifically.
Right. But so it's an evolutionary advantage.
But it didn't benefit the Canaanites.
But why should this group of people care about what benefits the Canaanites? See, my point is, so this, even though it's off in a way, it's still relevant because it shows how you have no real justice because they got away with it and they benefited from it.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying to me is it doesn't matter. In my worldview, you're saying that it doesn't matter to me what we do to each other. If one is stronger than the other, they should be able to take.
You say it matters because you still have imago content in your ethical system. I'm just saying it's at odds with your original presuppositions you say you hold.